Welcome to Perspectives. I'm Reed Cornwell, your host. My guest is Dr. Tony Gardner Medwin, Professor Emeritus of Physiology at University College London. In this edition, we will be discussing enhancing learning, teaching, and assessment through certainty-based marking. Tony, thank you for speaking with me today.
I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to speak with you.
Could you explain how you're using the term marking in this context?
It's about assessment, how we mark students' work. And actually, assessment is something that teachers don't usually regard as the favorite part of their job, but it's absolutely crucial to learning for students. Firstly, of course, assessment drives learning in the sense that students are motivated always to get good grades. Then the ways that we assess students actually are very strongly influential in how the students actually study and think. Thirdly, students, they need to learn to self-assess, to judge their own skills and their own abilities from thinking about their own work. And lastly, they need to practice. Self-assessment gives practice at very low cost to teachers and with little risk of humiliation to the students. Education is really all about learning how to think and how to relate things. It shouldn't just focus on students learning to repeat things. And this certainty-based marking is really all about trying to get students to think more when they're actually answering questions, which is part, obviously, of any kind of course.
Tony, I think of marking as grading and assessment as what the instructor does with the information derived from marking. Do you recognize that difference?
Well, assessment is a very interesting word because I think its origin is actually sitting beside somebody and interacting with them in a way that helps them to work better. And in universities and schools, I think we've got rather away from that concept of assessment. Assessment of a student, of course, should be a rather wide-ranging thing, and it should include aspects of their ability which are very diverse. For example, I feel that a transcript of a student's performance on a course should ideally include assessments of how good they are at expressing their knowledge, how good the breadth of their knowledge is, the reliability of it, their insight into problems, their ability to be creative about forming solutions to problems. So I agree that assessment is a very broad-ranging thing and shouldn't be expressed in a single mark. But if you look at the motivation for using CBM, it's to try to improve the student's attitude to individual little nuggets of what they're doing in a course. They're confronted with a question, and we're trying to improve their judgment about how best to get at the answer to that question, how best to justify the answer, and how to judge how reliable the answer to that question is. And on individual points where they're being asked a question, especially if it's a computer-based question, then assessment is bound to be encapsulated in a rather simple form, usually just a single number. And this is where the certainty-based marking does better than just making that number 1 or 0, depending on whether they're right or wrong. It actually takes account of how they judge the reliability of their answer to that. So marking is simply the generation of a number for a very small element of the overall assessment, is my view of the relation between the two words.
What are the mechanics of this system?
Essentially, it's very simple. The students, whenever they're asked a question that will be marked right or wrong, they also say how certain they are that they're getting it right on a scale of 1, 2, or 3. And if they do get it right, they'll get 1, 2, or 3 marks. So obviously it's in their interests, if they're sure of the answer, to say that they are certain, and then they'll get 3 marks if they're right. But if in that situation they're wrong, they will get a severe penalty. They'll get a double penalty, -6, twice what they would have stood to gain if they'd got it right. So you have to be careful and think carefully before you say that you're sure that you're getting an answer right. If you opt to say that you're actually uncertain of the answer, then you'll only get 1 point if you are right, but you get no penalty if you're wrong. So it's actually to the student's advantage to think about the subject enough that they realize that there's actually reasons for being unsure of their ground in giving an answer. Whether they end up thinking that they're unsure or that they're sure, the result of their thinking is actually to benefit them.
So certainty in this context is also analogous to confidence in what one knows. Is that a correct assessment?
Yes. The confidence, of course, is something that people can have as a general thing. People may be self-confident in their personality, or they may be very unconfident in their personality, but we're really talking about confidence about a very specific thing. Somebody who is not a very confident person may indeed be certain that they're getting a particular answer right. So when I talk about certainty-based marking, it's based on how certain you are of that particular answer, not of how confident you are in general.
By addressing certainty, it appears that you also address guessing.
Well, the guessing issue is very interesting, and actually I regard the way conventional marking treats guessing as completely indefensible in one way, because when a student makes a guess at an answer, and it's a lucky guess and they get it right, then the marking scheme on a conventional scheme treats this exactly the same as if the student knew the answer, which they did not. They had a lucky guess. So I think, in principle, you could sue an exam board for regarding those two things as equivalent. I think, in fact, that the only way to deal with the issue of guessing, and, there is a problem around guessing, you'd prefer that students, there should be more weight given to things that the student knows than to things a student gets by guessing right. The only way to deal with, really, is certainty-based marking. You don't want to discourage students from guessing or from a partial guess. What you want to do is to reward their acknowledgement that they're uncertain, and this is exactly what CBM does. And at the same time, it decreases the weighting that's given to correct answers when the student is uncertain, when they do acknowledge their uncertainty. So I think guessing is actually a fundamental issue that should not be dodged, and the way to deal with it in assessment is by CBM, certainty-based marking.
Why should teachers and learners use CBM?
Well, I think everybody agrees that it's important that you should think about how reliable your ideas are. It's obviously fundamental to doing well in studying and doing well in applying your knowledge. Secondly, is the issue of trying to encourage understanding of the issues, not just reacting immediately to a question. We find with a lot of our students, our medical students are very well, highly selected. A lot of them actually are very used to being able to pass exams based on just the first thing that comes into their head. And they don't necessarily think really beyond that sort of level in response to a lot of questions. They just answer it straight away and don't think more. And really what we want to do is to try to raise the stakes on answering questions so that they need to think about whether they understand what's going on in order to be able to tell whether they can justify it or whether they can see that there's a problem and that maybe there is good reason to be uncertain. We want to encourage students to think laterally. In other words, to try to think whether there are issues that are perhaps not the most obvious that also bear on the question that they're being asked, and to try to link different pieces of information that they have knowledge about together in a sort of network of knowledge that is really what people who are proficient in a subject have developed. When they're asked a question, they don't just answer it on the basis of one thing, but they can see why the answer has to be right because of all sorts of other pieces of knowledge that bear on that and that relate to it. The next thing here is that you really don't know something unless you're prepared to take a risk on the answer that you're given. If you just get the thing right because you've made a lucky guess, and that really is not knowledge, you really should be challenged as to whether you're prepared to bet on the answer, if you like. This is really what life is all about. There's an interesting issue that comes up about people who are actually not very self-confident about their knowledge in the subject, that they can often lose out in teaching and learning situations because through their lack of confidence, self-confidence, they often won't even be prepared to put their hand up or sort of volunteer ideas in a class situation. But they may actually be much better able to deal with the subject than they're giving themselves credit for. And through the certainty-based marking, they actually can learn that even if they start out by putting C equals 1 for a lot of their answers, that they will learn that this is actually not expressing their true knowledge, that they actually would get a better mark if they raised their certainty and if they were less diffident. And this helps their self-confidence. Next, it's actually, in many ways, the students immediately themselves appreciate that it's a more fair way of assessing whether they actually know the answers to questions, that a thoughtful answer that they actually can justify and see that it has to be right deserves more credit than if they actually think that they've remembered it right, but they're not really very sure, but they'll put it down all the same. They know that the first kind of situation deserves more marks than the second kind of situation, and the CBM scheme actually relates very directly to the way the students understand the process of assessment and self-assessment. There's a very important point that arises when students make confident errors. When they get a -6 on the CBM scheme, this means that they're pretty sure that they're getting the answer right, and they've in fact been marked wrong. Now, the various things that may be true here, the first and most common is that the student has a misconception about the subject, and really the -6 that they get in this kind of situation is a wake-up call. It helps to stimulate them to actually think more carefully about the information, the explanations that may be given in a learning situation in response to their answer, and it helps them to reflect about whether they really have this piece of the subject straight. And maybe they should go back and read the textbook about this and see why they were so sure about something was wrong. That's the most common situation. Of course, also sometimes it's true that the question has been rather poorly phrased and that it's maybe ambiguous or maybe it's plain wrong. And this is actually a situation of great value to the teacher, because the -6 in that kind of situation often leads to a sort of outrage on the part of the student that they've been penalized for misunderstanding a question that wasn't even clear in the first place. And what we find is that the students are very inclined to enter a comment there and explain why they did have this reaction to the question, and this helps the teachers to actually improve the quality of exercises that they're giving to students in a formative self-assessment kind of situation. Lastly is the just general educational point that if you're actually going to be able to study efficiently, then you must be constantly questioning what you know and thinking about the justification for what you know. When we read a paragraph explaining something, most of us in universities, we learn to constantly ask ourselves whether we understand what's gone before and whether we could make predictions from that and whether we could actually generate the ideas that are following on later on. The idea that you actually should, along with any idea you generate also a judgment about how reliable it is very fundamental to the whole process of learning and studying.
Tony, you wrote on your help page, knowledge is knowing what you know and what you don't know. This is similar to Confucius. Does this reflect his influence?
Oh, gracious. Well, I think what Confucius says is obviously right, but I mean, it's so deeply entrained in any kind of academic interaction in a sort of university context or a scientific context that when you believe something, you must also be able to justify it and use that justification to persuade somebody else it's true. And it's a terrible academic sin to claim something is true if you can't justify it. So what Confucius said, I think, is obviously very right. There's actually another thing that Confucius said that appeals to me in the educational context, which is that learning without thought is essentially a waste of time. And this is what I was saying earlier on, that indeed if a student learns something but they don't understand and they don't think about what it means, then it is a completely unproductive kind of learning, and it shouldn't be encouraged. So this is one of the things that we're trying to prevent students doing, simply learning to repeat things.
You have written that CBM tests knowledge, not facts. What is your definition of knowledge?
Okay, well, there's, of course, a long philosophical literature on what the definition of knowledge is, and it really, in everybody's book, it requires that the information be right, be correct, and that it be something that you believe, which is a matter of your probability that you assign to its being correct. So the certainty that you assign to something is very fundamentally a part of whether something is knowledge. And the third thing is justification. You must be able somehow to justify the answer that you're giving. And the important thing that CBM does is it requires the student to think about whether they are confident in their answer or whether they're not confident in their answer. That's very fundamental. And in order to do that, they really need to think about whether they can justify the answer. And if they can justify the answer and come to the conclusion that there's good reason to be sure it's right, then that's great. They'll get more credit as long as they are right. If they also, through thinking about it, they come to the conclusion that there's reasons for uncertainty about their answer, then as long as they acknowledge that uncertainty, they'll also gain by having thought through the issues. In fact, when you're marking student material, the thing that really gets under my skin, as it were, is when a student says something that is right, and you're pleased about that, but then a little bit later it turns out from something else they say or something that you get out of them by questioning, it turns out that the thing they said that is right is something that they don't actually even understand what it means. This is not knowledge. It's really just the ability to repeat facts or repeat in not even facts. It's repeating the expression, the words that express facts. If you did understand those words, it's really important that you should not regard just the repetition of sentences as being knowledge. Knowledge it must be the ability to justify the meaning of what you're actually saying. So that's really what I mean by knowledge, is the ability to justify things that you have good confidence in and that are actually correct.
Tony, tell us how certainty-based marking would fit into a teaching strategy.
Well, certainty-based marking is really used through computer assessment, and of course in a teaching program the most important thing is the teachers and how they actually interact with the students. And there are many aspects of teaching and many aspects of assessment that the teachers are essential for, and they must use their human skills. The certainty-based marking it makes the computers much more useful and effective in providing assistance to the teachers to free their time for that sort of a thing. It actually makes the students much more receptive to self-assessment on computers, and it helps to improve their study habits, I think, through that. So really, I'm far from an advocate of computers being a cure-all for all the problems in education, but we really must use them efficiently, and I think certainty-based marking helps in that process, using them as efficiently as we possibly can.
What are the educational goals of this system?
The main aim of introducing certainty-based marking is to try to get students to think more about the questions that they're asked. So it's really a part of the study that they do as the prime thing. We also use it for exams for the students, but the most important aspect of the certainty-based marking, in my view, is for students doing revision, students thinking about questions that they find difficult. Many students do very well in exams without really thinking very deeply about the things they're being asked about. The first thing that comes into their head is often good enough, it's often right, and they don't need to think any more deeply about that. But that's not really satisfactory, and it's actually damaging to the whole sort of attitude to learning.
Tony, can you summarize the findings that support the efficacy of CBM?
The kinds of evidence that we've accumulated are, first of all, informal reactions from the students, then there's sort of evaluation data from surveys of the students, then there's, of course, the results from analysis of results from the tests they've done and from exams they've done. We haven't tried to do any sort of formal comparison of students who haven't used CBM because it's very difficult to manage in a university. But the first thing that was obvious was that the students immediately see the benefits in CBM, and they don't seem to have any trouble understanding how to use it and the logic of it, and they actually, with practice, they get very good at using it in a nearly optimal, calibrated kind of way. So that has not been any problem. We actually, they've used it in exams for 5 years or so at UCL, and we surveyed them about their attitudes to this, and they voted really quite strongly. I forget exactly. I think it was sort of 55 to 35% or something like that, in favor of keeping CBM in their exams that they were having in the first 2 years of the medical course. In the exam data, it's actually, the data has shown that it's been really quite successful. One of the ways of assessing exam data is what's called reliability, which is really a measure of how well the exam is measuring something about the student rather than about chance factors, how lucky the student is with particular questions. And you can always increase the reliability of an exam by increasing its length, using more questions. But when we compare the CBM with conventional marking, we get an increase of reliability, which is really quite substantial. It corresponds to an increase of test length of about 58%, I think it was on average. And it showed up, the increase of reliability showed up in every one of the, I think it was 17 exams that we analyzed in data that's on the website. In addition, actually, to this reliability business, there's a concept of validity, whether you're really measuring what you want. You might argue that you don't want to be measuring how well students use a CBM system. What you want is to be measuring their knowledge defined in some other way. Even if you define their knowledge as the number of questions they get right in a test, regardless of their certainty about the answers, we find that the best predictor of that is actually the CBM score on a different set of questions. If you divide the exam into 2 sets of questions randomly, that if you want to predict the score on one set, the best thing to use is the CBM score on the other, not the conventional mark, even if your gold standard of what knowledge is the conventional mark. One of the concerns that there was at the beginning was that there might be biases, that students, there might be gender differences, for example, in the way in which students use CBM. People suggested that this might be unfair in penalizing students who weren't very confident, and they generally suggested it was going to discriminate against females. We've actually looked very carefully because of that at the data from our exams and from our online use, and there's absolutely no suggestion of any gender bias, and we don't have such clear-cut data, but again, the analysis we've done suggests no bias between different ethnic groups either. We have quite a mixed group of medical students at UCL, and there's no suggestion of differences there. Though interestingly, we find quite large differences between the risk aversion in exams compared with the risk aversion when students are working online. They tend to be much more cautious in the use of high confidence in the exams, so that we're really able to see quite differences that are quite small. We're quite sensitive to differences, and there's no suggestion of these biases that one might be worried about. As I said, we don't really have data that the graduates end up better if they've used CBM in tests than if they haven't, but really this would, in order to establish that, I think you'd really have to do a randomized controlled trial with students in a medical school. But it's actually very difficult to do that, because one of the things that we always encourage in a medical course is that students should work together, which means that if you try to allocate them to groups that did CBM and didn't, this collaboration between students would rather defeat the purpose of that, and it would be very difficult to draw conclusions. So, I mean, I'm rather opting out of trying to answer a question about whether there is definitely an improvement of the quality of the graduates, but I think the fact that they've been exposed to a new kind of technique for trying to improve their ways of thinking about their study is really sufficient to indicate that there's benefit in doing this rather than not doing it.
Whether you're talking about kids at school or college students, and however good or bad the students may be, the questions you ask them should actually engage them with the subject. And this actually is what makes students, what makes learning fun for students, fun and interesting.
Tony, thank you for sharing your innovative work and your thoughts.
Well, that's been a great pleasure. I really encourage people, if they want to find out more about certainty-based marking, to try it out and to look at the website that will help them to do that in any kind of context that they're interested in.